Hello, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are, and very warm welcome to our Rebellious Research Seminar. I cannot tell you how pleased and how happy I am today to have Susan Kerrigan with us. It's really, really important. We have such an important person who did so much work in our field with us today. As I was talking to Susan before the seminar in unofficial chat, I was saying that it was a huge omission. So I'm just so very pleased to have her with us this morning or this afternoon for Susan. So thank you so much, Susan. And just pass it over to you right now.
Okay. All right. I am going to, I think I share my screen first, and then I'll share the slides. Okay, you should be able to, can you still see me?
Yes, we can see you and we can see your slides. Yes, that's wonderful.
See the slides. Okay, that's great. All right. So yes, thanks for joining or for watching later. So the presentation is called A Systems Model of Creative Filmmaking, and I'm going to start by talking about how I came to be doing this type of work. But first, I will just acknowledge, as we do in Australia, that I am presenting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of those lands today. So I'm starting with a bit of a slide showing my time as a worker, worked in television production at the ABC for 13 years, and that was how I studied at the University of Newcastle, and I did communication and sort of did media production there a long time ago now. And then I worked in television for 13 years, and I ended up spending 5 years on drama production sets doing continuity, and worked in children's television for 3 years as a writer, producer and director. And when I left that employment, well, I sort of left that employment because I started a family, and working those long hours became rather impossible. So I then moved into academia and started to teach what I was practicing or doing as a professional, and of course got my PhD at the University of Newcastle. My supervisor, Philip McIntyre, is standing next to me, and he was the one who started the whole creativity journey for me. And his first question when I found out I had to enroll in a PhD, and he asked me, well, you've worked a lot in television, Susan, can you describe creativity? And I had no words to describe the thing that I thought I knew very well. And there began my whole journey, and well, now sort of career, 20+ year career, trying to understand what creativity is. So I then set about, and you might have read some of the work that I've done looking at creativity and creative practice, and what does it mean, and what does it mean to be a creative practitioner. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the main theories that I concentrate on, and some of the limitations, I think, with the theories, and where my research is sort of sitting now. So there I am pictured next to Philip, my supervisor, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who is the psychology creativity theorist whose work I draw on a lot. So Csikszentmihalyi said that creativity is not the product of single individuals, but it's of social systems making judgments about individual products. And that is a very interesting definition, because when we think of creativity and creative practice, we think of the things that we create that are something that is come from inside us, that it's our ideas we're sharing with the world. And yet in this definition, he is saying that, sorry, my phone is ringing. Anyway, he is saying that creativity is not the product of a single individual, but it's about social systems making judgments of individuals' products. And he's written he's passed away now, and couple of pieces and books that he's written. Very profound and deep thinker in his writing, with some incredible psychological studies behind. And he came up with this idea of the systems view of creativity, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. He says the systems view, you can start anywhere on this map, but we would normally start with the individual. So an individual is the maker and the creator, and we think this is where you start. But he says you could start with the field, the society, or you could start with the culture or the domain. So a domain of knowledge is what is the information that we draw on as an individual to come up with new ideas, to present those ideas to the field in order to create something new, which then, if it gets accepted by the field, it will get selected back into the domain. The domain is rather a large archive of knowledge. So when I think about the systems model, I think of the domain as a library of films, per se. I think of the individual as your own skills and knowledge as a maker. And I think of the field as crew, cast, heads of department, funders, peers. So the group of people that you might be working with. And Csikszentmihalyi says you need all those three things in order for something to function in the system, to produce novelty, because at the centre of his system, he's got the description producing novelty. So in terms of a filmmaker then, the domain knowledge that we're talking about will be these kinds of things. So it's how you go from a screen idea to a script, to a storyboard, to a series of shots, how those shots are then filmed on set, to move in production, the types of cameras you're going to be using, the types of editing software you're going to be using. Those things are the skills and practices that you learn and have on board, and you internalize those skills and practices in order to be good at what you do. How you then arrange yourself as a filmmaker inside an organization, so amongst your peers, is also part of the creative system. So how decisions get made across a series of groups, across multiple peoples, and in a collaborative way is actually something that I've been very interested in, sort of in researching further and more. And at the university I'm at, Swinburne University, we teach creative practice in our Bachelor of Film Production honours. We teach it in our 3rd and 4th years, particularly asking students to really consider what it is that they're doing when they're making those kinds of choices. So when you look at the systems model of creativity, you can talk about there's a simple model of creativity, which is the very first one. So it's one person simply picking up a camera and filming something and maybe editing it and sharing it. The slightly more complicated or complex model of creativity is a larger group, a larger peer group working together on a film crew. And then there are other systemic versions of creativity, which ends up being sort of the Hollywood, the bigger budget corporate productions that go in play, where multiple people and multiple hands, multiple people contribute to the creation of the idea. And it's that bigger part of the system of creative practice that I've become very interested in. What I ended up doing when I finished my PhD is the outcome of my PhD was to take the creative systems model that Csikszentmihalyi had done, and I adjusted it, because my PhD was done through making a documentary, and while the documentary was pretty ordinary, what I realized in making the documentary was that I was looking at what it feels like to perform or to act, to have agency as a creative practitioner, so I was inside the creative system and I was trying to represent that, whereas Csikszentmihalyi's creative system, he's standing on the outside looking at what it is to be creative. So my finding was just simply to talk about creative practice as the internalization of all those components. So you internalize all the knowledge inside the system to the point that you can behave intuitively and without thinking about it. So that's sort of this where the creative practices came from that I was describing. So in that sense, the creativity theories that I had been working with, which were from psychology, did actually and were able to align with the filmmaker's intentions and processes and practices, so that creativity emerges from the internalization of the rules of the domain and the opinions of the field, so that one can choose the most promising ideas to work on and do so in a way that will be acceptable to one's peers. So it's a very simple explanation there from Csikszentmihalyi's work from 1999, but it still holds true. And I suppose that's the thing that I found so fascinating about his work, is that whenever I have applied the theory to practice, I have come up again with the same result, which is that what he has said and states is true and continues to be held true. So I've had a series of PhD students who have used these creative systems theories in their own practices and in theses for PhDs, and just to demonstrate that these ideas can be applied in a number of different areas. So Vanessa Bates actually was a playwright, Australian playwright, and she wrote a contemporary Australian it was a comedy, a sitcom that she was writing for her PhD. Christie Street actually applied the theories to a filmmaking festival called the Shootout, and Shane Branston was a theatre professional, and he applied the theories inside the creative industries in the ecosystem at Newcastle. And Karen Nobes applied the same creativity theories, looking at contemporary Australian primetime television drama representation or with First Nations people. So in that sense, I'm suggesting that these theories might seem a little arbitrary, but they can be applied to practice. And there are some examples there. So now I'm going to sort of dive into the background of some of the theories and some of the theories that I think challenge us and challenge some common sense understandings around what creativity is. And I'm going to start by saying that for me, theory is a map. So this is the map of the London Underground, and this is the map of how you might get from one place to another. This is not the practical experience of traveling from one place to another, but it is just the station you might get on at and the station you might get on at. But if the train runs late, or the train is delayed, or if the train is going on a different route, or you get on or off at the wrong station, the actual experience of traveling on a train can be quite something different to what might be laid out on the map. And in that sense, applying theory to practice is exactly the same thing. The theories should be there to be tested, to make sure that those theories are actually accurate and rigorous and reflect the practice. And that's really the work that I've been doing for some time. So, and inside the space of creativity, there are a bunch of cultural assumptions. Whenever you mention the word creativity, everybody has a common sense understanding of what they think of it. So to be a researcher and to look at creativity, we've really been going back to the literature to see what the literature is saying. And generally the literature that I draw on is that literature is the literature that comes out of psychology. And over time, the psychology and even the sociology literature has been really accurate in describing what creative practice is. But sometimes it still doesn't get it right. And even though I've been researching in this area for 20 plus years now, I still don't think the literature is as accurate as it could be. So we still need more work to be done in this space. So when I start talking about what creativity is, we often start with this understanding of there are two ways people normally approach creativity. And Keith Sawyer has written 3 versions of this book explaining creativity, and he describes it really well. So people either think creativity is quite highly romantic, it it's something that it's a belief system that bubbles up from inside you, and that it's sort of an irrational and it's unconscious, and you know, and that you can't really help what comes out. It's just your process that's driving you or motivating you. So that's generally like a very rough description of what the romantic notion of creativity is, and it's commonly understood across and it's taught even in high schools, this idea that that creativity comes from within, and that, you know, lone geniuses and that kind of thing is where creativity sits. There are also some other theories which are in opposition to the romantic approach to creativity, and it's rationalism, which is that it's the belief that creativity is generated by a conscious, deliberate, intelligent and rational mind, and that creativity is something that can be learned. So the skills can be acquired and you can get better at it. And so it doesn't mean that you don't have an innate talent or innate disposition to behave in a particular way. That in the rational thinking, that's still part of it. So you can have a predisposition to something, but can still get better and better at it by learning skills and by making the most of what you're doing and taking on board other people's opinions to improve your work. So they're the basic two different approaches or understandings of creativity, and the romantic one is the one that bubbles up all the time. So posing this question, does creativity start with the filmmaker? And the one thing that really encapsulates this is the idea of auteur theory, which continues and has continued to this day, even though it's been critiqued a great deal. So auteur theory really started in the 1950s in France, and it was really about young filmmakers wanting to align their artistic and creative processes with the same kind of creative processes of writing and sculpture and composing. So they really wanted filmmaking to be aligned with art making. The thing about the writing, sculpting and composing, many of those kinds of processes are just individual, so one person does them. And the problem with filmmaking is that there was a whole crew needed to operate all of the technology and to organise the finances and the structure in order to make the film. So how could you dismiss all that other work? So the definition of auteur theory is that, you know, a true auteur was someone who, instead of merely transferring someone else's work faithfully and self-effacingly, the auteur transforms the material into an expression of his or her own personality. So they went sort of with the definition of auteur straight to that idea that one person controlled everybody on the team. And of course, this was a theory that was embraced for a long time. And so the idea that the auteur was the person, sort of the director that solely creates a film from within, it was really idolized, you know, throughout the Hollywood era. The problem is, over time, people started to research and think about it and realize that, in fact, you know, American directors like Hitchcock actually were working with the same creative crews the whole time. So they weren't actually working alone, but they were working in factory-like conditions of the studio system. And their films, of course, bore a singular vision, but it belonged to the whole crew. So, you know, the films of Hitchcock, Wells and Goddard, they all really did rely heavily on the contributions of their key creatives. And so therefore, many of those people that were called auteurs actually were so because they work with the same creative personnel. So when you start to see auteur theory from that point of view, you can see that there are actually some limitations with that kind of thinking, and also how that auteur thinking sits with that idea of a romantic ideal of just one person being responsible for the creation of a creative work. So looking at Bordwell and Thompson, everybody knows these texts quite well. So in 2005, I looked at an older edition of the text, and Bordwell there was sort of trying to make sense of what filmmakers used to do. So that they were arguing that, you know, we should take the filmmaker, their peer groups, their medium and their institutions as the final filter. So not just the gatekeepers, but transformers, always inclined to recast and repurpose the material coming their way. Once more, the filmmaker, not the culture, switches on the camera. So they were really trying to downplay this idea. They wanted to really emphasize agency of one person and say culture wasn't really the thing that was making decisions about what was and wasn't creative in terms of cinema. But in 2019, the same section in the book, they'd sort of adjusted, Bordwell and Thompson had adjusted the writing there, and they were saying then in 2019 that filmmakers belong to traditions because filmmaking ideas are shared by peers and are passed from expert to novice within a film tradition, favouring certain choices over others. So they'd sort of moved away from this one moment of agency of a filmmaker making a decision to sort of acknowledge that tradition becomes very important. And if you want to understand creativity and traditions a bit better, you need to look at Margaret Bowden's work. She's a UK scholar in Sussex, I think, University of Sussex, and she has written about two different forms of historical and psychological creativity. So she talks about historical or H creativity as emphasising traditions used within artistic domains as ideas that are novel with respect to the whole of human history. So they're the historically creative things. So, you know, the Mona Lisa, we can say, you know, Picasso's work, the French Impressionists, Leonardo da Vinci, all those kinds of things. We're told that they're creative because they're historically creative and no one would question that. And so she's acknowledging that there's something there called H creativity, but she also says there's something called psychological or P creativity, which is about a way to acknowledge that any human can actually come up with a creative approach to something that's new to them. Okay, so P creativity provides a way to assess an individual's ability to apply those traditions to their own work. So artistic traditions are important as they work a set of codes and conventions against which an artwork, in this case a film, is judged to be creative. So often we think creativity is actually about something that's out of the box and unusual, but the argument here is that often creativity is tradition and is historical. In order to understand the history of something or the tradition of something, then we can judge if something is a faithful representation of that history and is still making an original contribution, or whether it actually slightly changes the tradition and creates something novel or unique itself. So screenwriter Ian David, Australian screenwriter, was critiquing auteur theory very much and saying calling yourself an auteur in film is the most communal of art forms is so vain it's almost a clinical condition. Auteurism is at its narrowest is a miserable one-dimensional way of looking at the creative process of filmmaking, and yet auteur theorists would have us believe it is the only way that works of value come into existence. In fact, apportioning all of the creative responsibility and credit to the director is a symptom of our increasing desire to simplify complex processes of collaboration and collective responsibility down to bite-sized pieces. So it's a pretty heavy critique. It's an interview with Ian David in Stephen Maris's book on screenwriting history, theory and practice. So, really sort of calling out this idea that it's just denying collaboration and everybody else's contribution if you really want to endorse auteur theory. Duncan Petrie from the UK did his PhD on creativity and constraint in the British film industry with a great focus on the cinematographer. And Duncan's views were sort of the same, where he said the process is the production process itself is interesting in that it is essentially collaborative, with various experts making particular contributions at different stages of the process. However, the director maintains a position of overall primacy by virtue of being the creative coordinator, applying the necessary direction to the processes. So that was in 1989, and you can see there Duncan, through his writing and work, is trying to reconcile, well, someone has to lead the team, so can we give that person who's leading the team credit? And a lot of the constraint that Duncan ended up exposing and the research that he went on to do after his PhD was very much around how the technology and the processes and procedures actually were constraints that actually enabled choice making and enabled agency. Mass communication theory, the same sort of thing, with Berger talking about every film being a team effort, although the director is usually seen as the auteur or the author, or person whose artistic vision most directly shapes the film. So this was in 1995, when you can see him trying to reconcile, but we can't. How could we completely reject this idea of auteur theory? We need to acknowledge it in some way. And then later on, in some Australian media textbooks, media production textbooks in 2009, we had Cohen, Slazer and Bucket argue that auteur theory, in its romantic notion of the transcendent film director, fails to acknowledge the constraints placed on directors by the different modes and genres of media making and by the conditions in which media making occurs. Now, I know that probably we don't teach auteur theory in production anymore, and certainly our students also reject the notion of it, but it constantly comes up and crops up in different work around the place, and particularly in science academia. Particularly cinema and film study scholars still want to find one person to hang that authorial voice on. So this writing in 2005 by Hogan sort of wants this idea of auteur to involve the whole crew. So they're arguing that the director, producer, cinematographer, editor, the set designer, that whose oeuvre shows distinct characteristics for any aspect of the film, so narrative, sound, lighting or theme, those distinctive characteristics are the products of standard cognitive structures, processes and content. And then Cohen goes on, I think I've read that quote, to talk about, yes, the constraints on the director and the different modes of production. But you can see people trying to reconcile, to open it up a bit. So in some senses, we really should, I think, reject that notion of the auteur theory, because I think it's inaccurate. And I think, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any other kinds of theories inside the research that we do that have been able to silence, to put auteur theory completely away, because I think describing collaboration and creativity through filmmaking is actually such a large task. We haven't managed to yet achieve a theory or writings about the practice of doing it in a way that are conclusive and convincing and are used across the board. People are trying to, but I still think we haven't quite got there yet. And I suppose a lot of my work is trying to continue to do that. So there's some other work here by Dean Keith Simonton, and he's a psychology scholar, professor, distinguished professor actually, and he tried to understand cinematic creativity just by studying films. So he went and studied 1,132 films released between 1975 and 2002. And all of those films had received at least one award or a nomination from a number of different American film awards. And he was trying to work out whether you could understand creativity by standing, or cinematic creativity by standing outside the film, looking at the film and looking at all these awards. And what he argues is that creativity is often perceived as an individualistic phenomena. So it's epitomised in the popular image of the lone genius. For example, poets seldom collaborate with other poets in the composition of their poems, yet it's evident that certain forms of creativity require a group effort. The typical feature film, as the product of separate contributions of directors, screenwriters, actors, cinematographers, film editors, composers, art directors, costume designers, and a host of specialists in makeup, special effects, and sound. So what makes these cinematic contributions especially intriguing is that the individual contributions are not completely submerged or blended in the final product. So one of his main findings was that you couldn't really endorse one person leading the team, because when you looked at a film, you could see all those different crafts or roles actually rising up inside the film. And that's how the films were then awarded prizes based on the quality of the cinematic work that was presented to the peers who were judging the work. So Symington then did another paper, and he went on to look at group artistic creativity and creative clusters in filmmaking. And what he ended up arguing was that filmmaking represents a distinctive form of group creativity in which many individuals contribute to a single creative product. Which of course makes sense for anybody who's a filmmaker, but for someone standing well outside the area of filmmaking, he was just trying to get a more accurate answer. So it's interesting research to draw on then in terms of what psychology thinks of the creative artistry that sits inside cinema. So that brings us then to this question then, who makes art? Who's responsible for making art? And I'll turn now to some sociology theories about who makes art, art and artistic production. So Howard Becker was a jazz musician, and he played the piano a lot, and he also then went on to write about improvisational jazz. And his argument is that all artistic work, like all human activity, involves the joint activity of a number, often a large number of people. Though their cooperation, the artwork we eventually see or hear, comes to be and continues to be because of the collaboration. So he was, as a musician and an improvisational jazz musician, he was very interested in that notion of standing on stage and being part of the team that would support a trumpeting soloist or a saxophonist, or someone who was actually showing off in terms of musical improvisation. And he would, in his writings about art worlds, which are quite often referenced in a lot of sociology literature, he poses questions like, do you need someone to sweep the stage in order for the play to be the best play that can be performed on that stage? Is that sweeping of the stage as important as the work of the actors or the writers of the play? It makes a great topic to debate amongst your students at times, because it can literally divide the room. But you have to sort of take a stand, if you force students to, is preparing the stage as important as the players in the play or the writers who wrote the play. And I think if you really embrace Howard Becker's work, then you'll understand that he's arguing, yes, preparing for the work to be done is as important and contributes to the final product as much as the artistic contributions that we seem to focus on and recognise. We don't seem to focus on the menial stuff that supports the production of an artwork. And Janet Wolfe is another person who writes about the social production of art, and she argues in her book from 1981 that art really is a social product. Some of these things you will know quite well. So, you know, there was a time in the 70s, where there was a lot of discussion around the death of the author meant the birth of the reader. And we start to see there that romantic moving away from the power base that the author held in literature and criticism of literature to the birth of the reader, and that's continued into the digital age with, the rise of social media and everybody being, consuming content in the way we do today. We certainly understand the death of the author and the birth of the reader. But those three texts, written in a very similar time by Roland Barthes and Howard Becker and Janet Wolfe, really start to explain this idea about what is it that we do when we make art, and is it a collaborative production that is part of the art making world that we're part of? So Wolfe agrees with Barthes that the author is dead, but she points out the occurrence of two distinct activities. One is the creation of the artwork, and the other is the audience receiving and understanding the artwork and fixing their own meaning to the product. And this quote underneath was a quote that I really found to be quite profound during my PhD, so that the author as fixed, uniform and unconstituted creative source has indeed died, which is what Roland Barthes was arguing. But the author, now understood as constituted in language, ideology and social relations, retains a central relevance, both in relation to the meaning of the text, the author being the first person to fix meaning, that will of course subsequently be subject to redefinition and fixing by all future readers. And I think Wolfe's emphasis there that the author is still important, that you can't say that the author's intent should be negated just because the work goes on to live for generations or decades after it was made. But it's very hard for anybody to, if you're not of the time of the work, it's hard for you to understand, what was the intended meaning of the work by the original author. Perhaps Shakespearean scholars might have something to say about that too, because we have managed to find inside Shakespeare a lot of meaning that is still relevant to our time today. But anyway, those ideas from Wolfe are really important. And then you sort of get to this point of how do we as filmmakers fix meaning throughout different stages of the production process, which is sitting on the other side of the screen there. So you have a screen idea, you have a writer, a producer, you have funders, you have pre-production, so you have slightly different groups of people coming in, producer, writer, director. Then you have production. It expands out into the diamond shape with the director of photography, the production crew, the art director comes in, the sound recorders comes in. Post-production, you have composers and editors come in. And then finally, the screening audiences. So through all of those stages of production, you can actually see the shape of a film taking... Well, the film takes shape throughout each stage of production, and everybody does get to put their little fingerprints on it, which is exactly what Keith Simonton was talking about. So multiple voices coming in here to collaborate and negotiate. And I think this is where the practice and the collaborative creativity becomes very important. So then in the literature, you can turn then to some group creativity understandings. So Paul Paulus from the UK is actually in organisational management, and he's trying to make sense of group creativity from a organisational management point of view. And he says, from a rational and practical perspective, the socio-cultural argument is simple, that in the information age, it's simply become impossible for single individuals to process all the relevant information, knowledge and expertise. Whereas Keith Sawyer, who wrote that book explaining creativity, he says that creativity theorists argue that it's difficult to identify the one person who works within a group as being creatively responsible. that it's a bit of a fruitless and impossible search, because there's no single creator for many of the modern creative products that we like to consume. So you can say the same thing about popular music. So there's multiple people in a band, there are musical agents in there, there are record producers and musical engineers in there. So everyone puts their stamp on that artistic work that is then released to the public, which is exactly what Sawyer is arguing here about. How can we can't really pinpoint it to one person. So what is going on then with group creativity? Oh, that slide's in the wrong place. We'll move on. In that sense, then, here are some filmic structures. So here's another way to view how filmmakers organize themselves to make films. And this is quite a different view to the previous views I've put up of the structure of a film crew. So this is where producer, screenwriter, and then there are financiers, so funding agencies and business investors in there. And then there are production houses. In the circle, you can see what we think is the creative process of filmmaking. But there are also then so industry events, festivals, PR agencies, media traditions, and then there's distribution of the work as well. And then finally, audiences get a say. So all of those structures come into play in order to represent the group working, the group creativity at work to create a work. And some people, I think, might say, how is it possible for all of those people to have a say? But all of those people have to be able to endorse the work in order for it to proceed to the next level. And it's that endorsement at every stage of the process where, so people have to believe in the screen idea in order for the work to be made, and then for it to be released to audiences. And that's part of Csikszentmihalyi's systems model, which is about all of the peers. So the individual offers something to the peers, to the social field, and the field has to accept it in order for it to move to the next stage, which is hopefully into the domain. In that sense, so another organisational structure here is looking at the creative industries. And it's the same sort of thing, but we've scaled from an individual filmmaker making one single short film to a television production crew or feature film production crew. Then we've scaled up to an industry sector, which was the previous slide. And now we're scaling up again to an even bigger selection of industries, the arts, design, the media and information technology, where all of those things actually can be defined quite simply by Davis and Sig Thorson, who've got a great book on the creative industries. So they define the creative industries as all requiring some input of human creativity. So second, that they are vehicles for symbolic messages, that is, they all are carriers of meaning. And third, they contain at least potentially some intellectual property that belongs to an individual or a group. So in that sense, those three components to this definition, they all require some input of human creativity. This is the artistic component of creativity that we normally think is what creativity is, just that artistic component. The second bit, they are vehicles for symbolic messages, that is, they are carriers of meaning. That's the cultural component side of things. This is the cultural messages which sit inside every creative work that's sort of made, that makes meaning for audiences. And then the third component is that the intellectual property actually allows them to make money. And you can have creative works without making money, but in our economic times, normally people do need to or would like to be remunerated or draw an income from the work that they make. So in that sense, the intellectual property needs to belong to an individual or a group. So in some senses, the creative industries definition does actually link back to those original theories of Csikszentmihalyi's around what it is to be creative organised in this way. There's another model here of group creativity, which is Paul Paulus's model, and I applied this model in my PhD. It's quite old now, from 2003, and it's a very oversimplified model. Paul Paulus went on to do another model of group creativity, but I found it very complicated. So I actually preferred this one, but I still think this is not adequate enough to really describe the forms of collaboration that go on inside our areas. So here someone might have a brief, so an outside contract or a brief provided by an organisation. So, or you can say a film script which offers a brief. So the film script is there, it offers a brief, everyone comes on in their different crew roles at the individual level. So the director does their own individual processing with their own expertise around how they might actually apply their knowledge to direct the film. A cinematographer will do the same thing, art director will do the same thing. And then each of them individually come together, they offer up their ideas through a production meeting. You have a production meeting and everyone decides which way to go. And if the ideas that have been offered up are acceptable and are discussed as acceptable, well, then the group will move forward with it, and then and they'll agree, they'll have an agreement, and then they'll move on to the next scene or the next component of the script that they're going to be continuing to work on. If they don't agree with what to do, so say for example, the team's looking for an unusual location and they can't find the location, and they've been hunting for, you know, it's a key location in the film, well, then they'll just circle back around here, and they'll take the information that they've got, which is the location is no good, and they'll go and try and find another location. And until you get agreement on the location, the film can't proceed. So it's that's a very simple example of group creativity, but it's sort of, it works in the crudest possible sense. I do think that we could do better in terms of coming up with other kinds of examples for group work, particularly for filmmaking and teaching filmmaking. I don't think it's the greatest example, that one, but it sits there as and it's been written about, it's been used in organisational management. So other people have then written about creativity, so organisational creativity, and Sawyer and Henriksen have talked about organisational structures and culture and contextual factors such as the market and the regulatory climate that really impact on organisational creativity. And often we dismiss those kinds of things when we think of creativity as just being artistic. There are commonly held beliefs that creativity starts with an individual, and they've been challenged as organisational management researchers suggest creativity can be found within businesses and how they organise their group creativity against management strategies. Vlad Glavino actually, he doesn't use organisational creativity, he's a psychologist, but he has a term called distributed creativity. So if you're looking for theories that talk about how you might share cultural things or like Vlad's PhD was actually looking at egg painting, so at how you decorate eggs by hand in a European culture, and what he was trying to understand is what happens inside that culture and how is that craft or tradition continued on. So he came up with these theories of distributed creativity, which is about the sharing of ideas between multiple actors, creations, places and times, which for him is more about informal communities than business organisations. So I think creativity now in filmmaking should sit inside the informal communities, but also the formal, the business and the IP retaining content, retaining rights and copyright over IP is also important and needs to be considered whenever we are talking about creativity and creative practices. So technologies are also something that's rising to the fore very much these days. And creative technologies is a term which is appearing in lots of different places. And it's almost like artistic is starting to somehow blend in or being overtaken by creative technologies, particularly with AI and the way that's going at the moment. And how do we reconcile human agency inside AI? So that's going to be one of our next big challenges. But really, Sawyer and Hendrickson are arguing that technologies are digital artifacts or tools that extend human capacity for thinking, making, or creating beyond our innate mental capacities. And in that sense, they're trying to argue that the digital technologies are still containing things which hark back to the traditions of human agency, though these arguments are still need to be more thoroughly explored. But I think this is the frontier, this is the future for our thinking now, particularly if we want to argue that as humans we are still in there making decisions and making cultural decisions that are meaningful for us as humans. Now to the final stage of the presentation. I've got about 10 minutes left. Okay. Okay. So I think I'll skip over that one. So
take your time, Susan. We're very flexible with time.
Okay, all right. So just talking about filmmaking and collaboration, though, and then back again to this idea of the systems model. So Eva Redvall has written about the systems model as well. And so she's also stood outside the system, but she's tried to make sense of it, looking at Danish television drama production. And this is a great explanation of the model as a teaching tool, because she talks about, remember, Csikszentmihalyi said you could start anywhere inside the system, but she talks about the individual as possessing a number of traits: talent, training, and track record. She talks about the field as possessing mandate, management, and money. And then she talks about the domain as taste, trends, and traditions. And in understanding Csikszentmihalyi's work, in order to produce novelty, all of these things need to be in harmony, and they're all important characteristics of each of the individual field and domain in order for a creative work to be produced. So there's a lot of the theories also point to the idea that if an individual is working inside a system, they've probably been working inside a system for 10 years or more before they get to a point of being able to act intuitively or tacitly without actually thinking about it. But in order to take on, we often just focus on the individual, so the talent, training, and track record. And the point is that we often forget about the mandate, management, and money, and we often do also ignore taste, trends, and traditions, so the fashions of any field that one's working in. But those things are as important parts of the creative process as the actions of the individual. And I think how Eva's laid this out here actually really is simplifies it and helps you to understand how the system can be functioning and operating inside of you. So Eva calls her model the screen idea system because she's drawing on Ian MacDonald's work. And Ian MacDonald wrote this terrific book, Screenwriting Poetics and the Screen Idea. And he drew on a lot of Pierre Bourdieu's work, who's a sociologist as well. So MacDonald was really fascinated in the idea that, what is a screen idea, and is the idea in your head, the one you've got on the page, is that the one that someone else has read? Is that the same idea the producer understands, the cinematographer understands? Is that going to be the same idea? How do you make that idea into the film so that the audience can understand the screen idea? So it's sort of an amorphous thing, the screen idea, but it's a great concept to introduce students to help them to understand that what's written on the page might not be read exactly in the way they might like, or someone working collaborating on the project may not understand the idea as it's written on the page, which means you have to be open to feedback. So the goal of the concrete never arrives, as the screen work will continue to develop as each draft of the scripts becomes one more fixed version of the screen idea, and the final film, the screen work, is just another version of that. So the argument there is that at every stage of production that the work moves through, it actually becomes more and more fixed in terms of the meaning that the film's going to make. So the screen idea exists in the minds of all of those involved in the production, which I think is just really quite delightful. But do we know if everybody's seeing the same thing? So the screenwriter, producer, director, and others, the cinematographer, production designer, sound designer, and the editor. Though, of course, it can never be exactly the same idea, and it will never be complete. So the screen idea is something that continues to go on because it's actually different then from the film that could be made or would be made. But as filmmakers know, sometimes the best films are the ones where the collaboration has been the strongest, and the collaboration has allowed people to really understand what everyone is suggesting, and then that negotiations that happen together actually allow for the best films to be made because they represent everybody's work so well. In that sense, the screen idea allows us to talk of what lies behind what is on the screen. So it's about the beliefs and the practices, what individuals or the team are contributing to the film, what institutional structures that relate to their activities that are important to make sure the film is the best it can be, how orthodoxies and common norms are applied, and how society is also represented in the film. So we're getting into quite deep sociological ideas here, that how issues of political economy interact, not just with the production in a technical sense, but with the initial concepts of and appropriate forms of production. So a lot of MacDonald's ideas are drawn on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and some of you will probably know the cultural production theories by Bourdieu. He talks about habitus and the different forms of cultural capital and different dispositions which become important, and also the doxa. So habitus in some senses is a great description of the same thing that Csikszentmihalyi was going for with the creative systems model. In fact, Bourdieu's work from a sociological point of view is describing an activity of cultural production that is very similar to the activity that Csikszentmihalyi describes with his creative systems model. So both of them, one from psychology and one from sociology, were looking at the same problem, and Csikszentmihalyi from psychology was looking at how does an individual function to be creative, what choices are in front of them to be creative, what are they faced with, what choices do they make, and how do they realize the creative work. Whereas Pierre Bourdieu, as a sociologist, was interested in the society, so how society constrains the actions of a group of people that are working together. So these two theories sort of sit quite nicely together, and here you can see we've created, my colleague and I, or Philip McIntyre, created this visual description of the cultural production theories, where it's quite similar to the systems model and the revised systems model that I came up with, which had creative practice at the centre, that the sociological theories that cultural production sits at the centre, and it's about how agents, individuals and fields and the space of work or the archive all interact together. So how you access ideas, how the agents and the field interact together, and how the field then has ideas selected into the space of works or into the archive in order to create new work. So in that sense, I'm coming back to the three different representations of the creative systems theories that I was talking about. So Csikszentmihalyi is the main theoretical framework, and then from his work, I applied his work to my creative practice to come up with what it's like to internalize the creative system in order to create something unique and original. And then what Eva did with her work was she was looking at externalizing the creative system. So how do you describe the creative system, but from an external point of view? So what we call creative is never really the result of individual actions alone. It's in the products of three main shaping forces. So a set of social institutions or a field that selects from the variations produced by individuals, those that are worth preserving, a stable cultural domain that will preserve and transmit the selection of new ideas or forms of the following generations. And finally, the individual who brings about some change in the domain, a change that the field will consider to be creative. But those three sort of theoretical maps can describe what it is to be creative. There's another final one, which was looking inside the creative industries and how does this work as a very much larger sort of creative activity. So in terms of an ecosystem, which is certainly scaling it right up to beyond industry to sort of global ecosystems. How do they operate and function? But that's probably something that could be discussed in a very different presentation. These ideas are rather complex, and I suppose I started with auteur theory because I think it's so strange that it's still hanging about and it still rises up in terms of people's understanding of what filmmakers do, that you have to be an auteur in order to create a creative film. I think I would argue deeply against that, but I believe now that creativity is not just artistic. I think it's about artistic work, it's about technologies, and it's about organisations. I think we have to have a new interdisciplinary approach to look at creativity, and I'm writing a book with my colleague James Verdon called A Creative Lens on Filmmaking. We're looking at traditions and innovations in the screen industry. It'll be released next year, and it'll have some more of these ideas about the interdisciplinary approach to creativity using artistic, technological and organisational forms of creativity. And these are all the very smart people who helped form these ideas in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I was vigorously taking notes as you were speaking. I have lots of questions, as you can imagine. It was really, really fascinating. And then it's pretty clear that the idea, the concept of creativity is really fascinating to the very human nature, and that's why we have so many theories coming from so many different disciplines. And obviously, we talked about excuse me, we've heard you talk about psychology, sociology, and industries, and so on and so forth. And I think it's quite refreshing from my perspective, seeing that actually there's more and more publications to do with filmmaking that are focusing on these other type jobs or roles within the industry that are really important. So, books being published about people making costumes or art design or things like that. So I think there is definitely a change. But I was about to ask you really about perhaps the way it starts, because you've mentioned education, and I'm thinking about my own students, and I wonder whether the challenges we have with this approach comes from the way sometimes we teach filmmaking. And it might be very different in your institutions, but I know that in many places students are before they get into more specialized roles, they are just tasked with the idea of you have to make a film. And of course they do collaborate and they do form their own crews, but at the end of the day, in their own little micro industry bubble they create, they're being marked for the very big task of make a film. And and I wonder if it kind of sparks this idea, well, I am the author, I am the one responsible for the thing, and very often I don't know if you have the same, if you've witnessed the same problem, but I have some students who are really against collaboration, and they say, well, the less I collaborate, and obviously going forward in the industry, more creative I can be because I'm independent and I don't have to rely on others. And quite interestingly, I also for the book I'm co-editing with my good friend on fiction filmmaking as research as well, we have some chapters submitted where people write about this journey of coming from the industry to more experimental, individual way of filmmaking, because it gives you more freedom to be creative. So I have a feeling that there's kind of two ways of thinking about it, and I completely agree that it depends on the situation, and sometimes in some very restrictive industry, big productions, you might lose some of this creativity. I was wondering if you can provide perhaps any comments what you think about it. So both the education standards in terms of how we actually teach filmmaking, but also perhaps this concept, whether this is true or not, of being more creative when you work by yourself or on this much smaller scale. I wonder what you think.
I'm keen to answer, but I'll probably get halfway through and then forget the other question. So you'll have to prompt me. But
yes, of course.
The idea that where do I start? So I've been teaching filmmaking in universities for 23 years, and I was we'd often allow students to create whatever they want, but often with students, the limitations of the quality of the work they create is because they don't have the skills to do the work themselves. So often if you let students make an individual film by themselves, you want them to get to the point where they realize they need other people because they don't have all the skills necessary to make the film that's in their head, right? And then again, if you've taught many students, you'll know there'll be some students who'll pitch an idea in there that they've got and they don't have the skills at all to make any of it. And you have to keep pulling the scope of the production back to something that's achievable so that they don't feel like a complete failure. And like, it's really hard to teach students who don't have the skills but have an idea. It's like, oh, well, you're probably going to be a great producer because you aren't practical enough to have the skills. But you have to allow them the opportunity to work out where they fit and what crew role they might do best and where they fit inside that sort of collaborative system. And also, I think teaching students how to give each other feedback. So actually leading them through a process of feedback. So how do you go about critiquing something? And, often they'll be reticent to say something, even though they can see there's something not quite right in the approach to production or how to shoot something, but they're not quite sure how to give feedback because they think one person needs to lead them. And so you have to really sort of get inside it and guide them and encourage them, mentor them to be able to provide feedback and then be open to receive feedback at the same time. In terms of industry professionals that come back into the sector, right? So if you have worked in industry, you've probably trained in a particular role and probably spent a number of years sort of training and so acquiring high skills. So it makes good sense that you might come into academia from the industry and then want to make your own work and probably you might be skilled enough to be able to be producer, writer, director and to do quite a lot of the work by yourself. But that just shows that you've completely internalized all the components of the system so that you can actually function without thinking about it. Okay, so I'm just trying to point out that the theory still holds true. The more work you do and the more high skilled you are, the more tacit your ability is to make decisions and choices, and the less you have to think about it. You just go about doing it, and it's harder for you to stop and explain to everyone what you're doing, which is probably often why you might not choose to work with other people. So I really enjoy teaching students filmmaking, and I really enjoy that challenge of trying to get them to collaborate and trying to get them to talk to each other. And at Swinburne, we're really lucky because we are teaching in a fiction filmmaking degree, really. We have more fiction films than we have documentaries being made, and they have the sort of 8 HOD roles, I think, head of department roles that they do, and we're really trying to push them to talk to each other and to develop their skills in a way that they can critique and collaborate. And I also think that when you're teaching the students, you should probably teach process more than product. So I don't put so many marks on the final product. I put more marks on the process and reflection on the process. So what did they learn as they were making stuff, and so it's really a creative practice approach. Like, are they reflecting and understanding what they're doing? And, everybody makes first time mistakes when you make a film, and you just wait for them to make the first time mistakes, and then they get better when they make their second film or their third film, but often by the time they're up to their third film, they're graduating, so you never see them again. We really have them at the very early phase of their career when they're in an educational system. So there are often quite a lot of common things, I think, that you find them doing. What were the other parts did I answer? I didn't think I answered.
No, you did answer both of them. Yeah, and actually, it's such a great answer because it leads me to my next question. I promise I will open for questions from the public, but I just wanted to because it links so nicely to the idea of screen idea you were talking about, the idea of process. And the idea of kind of how it really is, it's just going from one stage to another, and the process is being quite flexible. But as you were talking, it really made me think that all of that really boils down to the idea of communication, just really as simple as that. It's how people with different set of expertise are able or not. And you were saying in a fascinating way of like whether what's in my head, whether my idea is the idea my collaborators have. And this is really, it can describe creativity, it can describe life as well. It's just how well are we able to just really communicate. It's quite fascinating. And even talking about all the models and talking about the author, and obviously you were actually talking quite a lot about script writing, so how this idea on paper just gets materializes in itself through the work of other people who are just going to be doing all the different jobs in filmmaking. It's quite fascinating. Obviously we could also apply Hall's theory of communication and how we negotiate, reject, all of that, but it really boils down to communication at the end of the day. It's quite fascinating.
Well,
and
sorry, I'm going to say communication, but it's about meaning making. So you aren't just putting ideas into a recording which is edited, which an audience will make meaning out of. It's how you make meaning out of the process of doing that as well. Like there's sort of a double entendre there, I think, which is really. Yeah, which is the thrill of, like, when a crew hums together and everyone knows what they're doing, there's sort of a lift. And I mean, sometimes the product can be not very good, but everyone feels like they might have done it, and that's where the joy is in and of the process. It's itself, the creative process is that, which is flow theory, which Csikszentmihalyi, I didn't talk about flow theory, but Csikszentmihalyi is well known for the flow theory stuff. So it's where level of challenge and level of skill actually meet, and you go into that flow state. And often, collaborative filmmaking is about achieving group flow, so everyone working together. Sometimes it can mean the film can be great. Sometimes it can mean it might not be great, but it is about that meaning making in the moment too.
Absolutely. It's quite fascinating. Now, I do have to ask about AI, and you did mention that because obviously the idea of creativity, in many people's minds is rather threatened with what creativity stands for, and we all see more and more artists and filmmakers applying AI in one way or another in their creative process, but also trying to understand conceptually what it really means in terms of contribution to creative process, and whether there's a way for us to use that tool in a way which still is creative. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas of what's your opinion about what might or might not happen, and how our idea of creativity will be shaped or could be shaped with AI.
I think it's going to change a lot of things. I think it expedites a lot of processes. I think we're already using it in a lot of our software and a lot of our tools already, not just in our mobile phones and sort of our sort of normal Word software and that kind of thing, but in terms of social media and that kind of thing. So I think we're going to lose some of our knowledge and understanding about how we go about things. And but there's been technological changes over over many, centuries, right, where practices and processes get interrupted and disrupted by technological changes, and innovation, like part of innovation is to disrupt the existing forms of technology. And we are going to lose some things, and it's going to be sad, but also possibly it's going to open up other opportunities that we didn't know existed. So with any form of creative destruction, Schumpeter talks about that. With any form of destruction, there will be birth. So I think I'm hopeful that that there will be new jobs and new ways of doing things that weren't possible before. The problem is the stereotypical visuals that come out at the moment, and it sort of has AI is I heard someone the other day said it has a style of its own. It has a visual style of its own. And I thought, oh my God, it's already forming its own genre and we're already going to hate it. Like, we're going to start to dislike it because it's so predictable and horrible. I really hope that, the Pierre Bourdieu's theories of sociology will hold true, and we will rise up around it and find other ways to critique it, to hold on to our culture. I think the automation side of things is pretty frightening. I don't know. I mean, we're writing about this in the book. It's pretty hard when it's catapulting at such a rapid speed, through our lives at the moment, because you just get a handle on it and then it changes again. So maybe some of the people on the call might have some suggestions about it too, but
which is a good
I hold on to some hope.
Yeah, I think we live a very interesting moment for that. I think it might be, as you rightly say, within the next months or years, things will be changing, possibly to the degree we cannot predict. But that's a very interesting point. So you said that maybe someone in meeting has any comments or questions. So I think it's a good moment for us to open. So is there anyone who would like to ask Susan a question or provide a comment? Nick, if you want to unmute yourself, just go ahead.
Good morning. So it's a little early here in Canada, so I've written something down because I can barely remember my own name at this hour.
Thank you for being here with us.
That's amazing.
Thank you, Susan.
You're in Canada. I'm in Australia. Some folks are in the UK. Fantastic. Lovely to hear from you, Nick.
So, Susan, I've always appreciated your research. It profoundly impacted my dissertation. But I'm going to say this model, I think, is one of the most important papers I've read in production culture. I'm a research practitioner with 40 years of experience in the film industry, so your ideas deeply resonate with my lived experience. So my question,
wow.
In addition to shaping public perception of filmmaking, auteur theory has created and enforced the political and economic structures of the production world. And I'd argue it still has a great deal of traction in academia. So your radical, and in my experience, very accurate model is going to face fierce resistance. And is it possible that pushback to AI will further entrench the idea and power of the human auteur? In the public imagination is the idea of a system that different from AI.
I think the thing about AI and the individual, so the thing about the systems model is it talks about an individual agent, and one of those limitations is that I'm trying to argue that we work collaboratively. So in my model, I changed it from individual to an agent, because an agent could be plural, and an agent can also be a computer, right? So I'm not actually in the model. Theoretically, you can't possibly differentiate between an individual and a human and a computer agent. That's where some of the thinking sits. What I hope that you could theoretically argue and could be held on to is the idea that AI is a confluence of factors that are coming in. So it's a confluence of ideas that convalesce inside AI. So I think in that sense the agent is plural and communal, and I then want to hold on to the fact that that communal pluralness will bring us culture, will allow culture to remain there as being important, because culture is social and plural. Did I sort of answer? I was sort of answering in a theoretical sense, not a really practical sense.
Well, that's enough of it. It is. I just want to be dead clear here. Your ideas were exceptional. Like, it was dead clear what you're doing. I'm just worried that in sort of in the public sphere, people looking for easy answers to complicated questions are not going to see that nuance. And I worry. I mean, these are important ideas, and they need to get out there. So I'm just worried that you're going to face some resistance.
Oh, yeah, of course, and it's what I sort of said. I've sat inside presentations at my own university where people are talking about auteur theory like it's alive and well, and I've just gone, sorry, really? Is it still alive and well? And when I've asked my students, do you believe in it? They go, yeah, no, we don't. And I'm like, okay, you don't, but people do. And this is the difference between a common sense understanding of something and a rational researched understanding of something. And all we can do is write it down and hope someone reads it and teach it to our students to hope that people take it on. But because we're human beings, we want to be able to bestow knowledge on one person. We can't help but do that. And so I'm not so much of a psychologist, but it's our want to do that. So if you read a lot of the literature on educational theory and creativity, from a very early age, all anybody wants to do is to applaud the creative traits of one individual child. So until we change how we think about the individual child's achievements as being part of a group or a social network, these ideas and thinkings that I'm talking about will continue to be perpetuated through our culture and through our educational systems. You can't, there's a creativity conference that's held in Oregon. I've been a couple of times, and Csikszentmihalyi presented there, and Keith Sawyer's presented there. I've seen all the gurus that I know and admire there, and there are a lot of educationalists that go there, and a lot of people that want to believe that they're nurturing creativity individually in all of the students that are in front of them. I just don't think we can get away from it. But I think all we can do is talk about the power of more than one person having an idea, more than one person sharing an idea, more than one person critiquing an idea and, joining the idea together. Again, I'll tell you just a little aside. So Philip McIntyre, my supervisor, my PhD supervisor and colleague, who really mentored me and was amazing. He introduced me to Csikszentmihalyi's theories in the beginning, and he's a musician. And I said to him, why are you interested in creativity? Where did that start? And so he was a musician, and you all know AC/DC, the Australian band AC/DC, the heavy metal band, right? So he used to mix the sound desk at the back of a band, a cover band playing AC/DC. And he said, every night when they played a particular song, I would have to protect my sound mixing desk because the crowd would just go off every night, always the same song. Like, what is that about? So he was very interested in the communal enjoyment of something, the creative collaboration, the meaning making that happens in those moments, and when he describes it like that, you go, oh yeah, I get it, right? And even though we all want to be individually recognized for our creative achievements, we also all want to join in together and do something together. That's the collaborative thing. And that's the bit I find really fascinating. How do you reconcile those two things? And yeah, can we? I don't know. I think I've just argued that we probably won't in our Western education system, where we idolize individual traits. Until that changes, we won't we might not. I don't know. It's a big question. It's a huge question, Nick. I'd love to see your research. I'd love to exchange some emails with you and find out where your thinking's up to, because, you know, I think we are human beings and we are social. We learned anything from COVID, it was that most of us don't cope terribly well in isolation. Even the introverts who like to be isolated, you know, actually do like a little bit of social interaction. So, and this is why this theories, the psychology and the sociology, are so fascinating, because one is looking at the individual, Csikszentmihalyi, and so sociology is looking at the group. It's like, but they're both talking about the same phenomenon. You know, I think I find them fascinating because of that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So
Thank you. Your question's been great.
I also think, if I could just add to it, I think, and you said that in your upcoming book, you'll be looking at this interdisciplinary connections, but I really think a part of the problem is going back to education again. It feels like I'm blaming education for everything, but obviously the way we teach any kind of creative disciplines is by discipline. So, you know, you're a musician, you're a photographer, you're this, you're that, and you have your own theories. And one of the big part of my own challenge, which I was writing in my book, which was aimed to help PhD students who are working with filmmaking, was this idea of, we always put in these silos, and you as a person educated within a specific discipline, you have your own society, you have your own conferences, you have your own journals, you have your own network, and you really need to kind of get to know it, but you don't tend to go beyond this. And this is the idea of being really trapped in your discipline. And I remember reading it somewhere, that the idea of being interdisciplinary, which was a very, very popular keyword in any kind of funding bits or whatever to do with academic writing, was one of the most misunderstood words, because everyone says it, everyone wants to be interdisciplinary. No one really properly knows what it meant. So I really look forward to read your book once it's out. But I have a feeling the idea of, and it's not that we can necessarily get away from the idea of disciplines, because we need them. We need them to understand, to get our head around how everything functions. But yes, I think we also need to transgress this to some degree. We need to be able to see beyond and understand in a very beautiful way, like you were saying about the difference between theory and practice, that it's a map. And then the practice itself has to be, so all the theories have to be tested. You said it so beautifully. And that's exactly what it is in terms of discipline. So you have your discipline, and then you have to kind of break it after, once you discover your own creativity. So I think just being a little bit more open-minded about all these ideas we are taught and we're given to understand the world. So we almost have to construct something to deconstruct it afterwards, to then be free to discover our own creativity, which is quite a process, really. And I have a feeling that education many times takes us to the first point, like you have to construct your understanding, but it doesn't really guide us on how to then break it into pieces again. So maybe that's the issue. Now, I'm aware that we are out of time, so we're just going to take the last question. I think we have Myri, if you want to. Yeah.
Hi. Yes. Hello. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Agatha. That was really interesting. I too have written down my question, because it's just for time efficiency. So my question, I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot from it. And it's great to hear that auteur theory isn't considered as standard, but I do acknowledge it when I hear colleagues talking about it. But my background, so I'm a program maker, documentary maker in TV, and now I'm an academic. So I am coming from this narrow prism. But do you think there needs to be a delineation between, so you've got TV production and film production, the industry, and then you've got independent filmmakers who are making artistic films that are going in film festivals and cinema release. Do you think there needs to be a delineation between those two? And I know that's quite narrow and you're talking more system wise, but do you see a difference between those? Because I do, when I've spoken to filmmakers in those two areas, that the people working in production are totally impacted by the system that they're working in, and, you know, with the colleagues they're working in. I'd just really like to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Yes, I think they have different aims and purposes. That, you know, one is sort of, and I came from television production too, and you know, my PhD was on making an independent documentary, which was pretty terrible actually, but because I didn't have the skills and I didn't have the team around me, which is why the creativity theory I think spoke to me so well to describe the terrible practices and processes that I just didn't have on board to actually make the film that I wanted to make. But to teach, the independent filmmaking is very different from the systemized structure that happens inside television production, and then there's sort of short film and feature filmmaking, which is also, and it's global. It continues to be global. Documentary can be, of course, more local than it, which is great about it because it is localized. I don't know whether I've answered the question, but there are differences, and I've got stacks of books that talk about the differences because I'm completely obsessed with, how can you teach students those things? You can't teach students how to behave like a television crew because they're not actually a television crew. So you have to teach them to start somewhere, and then you have to get them to sort of scale it up to the point that maybe when they graduate, they may be ready to participate in a bigger crew. So you then end up teaching, different kinds of skill sets that are very sort of low level. But in the television sector and in the feature film sector, the forces at work are so financially driven these days that they affect every choice that is made, and there's quite a different approach then to sort of creative originality. So creating an original idea that punches through or meets the cultural expectations of something, and then all the people that work on that need to understand the brief to realize the brief. So anyway, we probably should have a chat about it, Murray, because it's a very interesting thing that you point out, and it's hard to reconcile it, particularly with the collapse of sort of television that's been happening with the streamers and all those. So my brain really goes into that organizational, financial setups and structures there, and the global approaches to that, which we suffer from here in Australia. I've written about this stuff we did some research nationally in Australia, talking to filmmakers along the Eastern Seaboard. So I've got a paper that talks about the employment processes and structures. It's a real creative industries paper that talks about independent filmmaking and high-end filmmaking and feature filmmaking. So, the ideas are sort of sitting in that in terms of creative industry arguments too, which I can share with you if you want to send me an email. We could have a chat a bit more about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
They're great questions, you guys. They really are.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here today, Susan. I know it's quite late where you are, so I really, really appreciate your time. It has been just really wonderful. I will make it available online as soon as I possibly can by the end of the day and share the link. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining live, and enjoy all of you who are watching this online. And million times thank you, Susan. You've been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you all listening to me. Yeah, it's really great. I'm really glad you think the ideas are worthwhile too. I think that's what's the most important thing. So, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Agatha. Thank you for organising it. So great to present here. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you so
everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Good morning.